Okay, hello and welcome everyone. I'm Jason Gumpert from msdynamicsworld.com. Thanks for joining us for today's event on AX Master Planning. Today we're joined by Jake Roeder of Dynamic Consulting. He is a senior solutions consultant for them, and I'm really happy to welcome Jake as a first-time presenter for us. I think it's going to be a great event. We had a really good response to today's webcast, so welcome everyone. As we get the event started, please know that you can ask questions today. During the presentation, you can use the Q&A panel that you should see to the right of the main presentation window to ask Jake questions. He will be answering those throughout the event with some help from his colleague John. And without further delay, Jake, let me hand things off to you.
Thanks, Jason. Can you hear me all right?
We can.
Great. Thanks for joining us today, everyone. There's a pretty good turnout, so I'm pleasantly surprised by that. Like Jason was saying, today I'd like to talk about master planning a little bit in Dynamics AX. Some tips and tricks, some common stuff, and then some very specific points that people usually find interesting. I think this is a pretty good presentation, and hopefully people enjoy it and get a lot out of it. So just if we go through an agenda here, I'm going to do a short intro, and Jason kind of stole my thunder there and told you who I am, I guess, but then we're going to get into the basics, specific settings, some descriptions of time fences and coverage groups, some more miscellaneous, like I said, fine points of master planning, and then we're going to follow up in forecasting. And at the end, if we have any questions, or throughout, if we have any questions, like Jason said, use the Q&A module of webinar here, and my colleague John Stipple will be perusing that, looking for questions and interrupting me, hopefully, during the session. I like to do this usually. This is a great session in person because people get pretty involved and have a lot of questions and have a lot of feedback, and a lot of times that's some pretty important stuff as well, but hopefully we'll be able to do this kind of silently. So, like I said, we'll start out with a short intro here. My name is Jake Roeder. Jason said I'm a senior solution consultant with a company called Dynamic Consulting. We're an AX consulting firm based out of Chicago. I focus in the trade and logistics area, production, master planning, and then also I like to kind of get involved in BI and reporting as well. So like I was saying, this session I usually do in person, and I have some questions that I open up to the audience about which version you're on, how you use master planning, if you actually believe it or not. But since we're doing this kind of remotely, I'm going to at least share what I normally see from people. So throughout the years, I've now seen people kind of progressing towards versions 2009 and 2012, and then later, of course. And as far as master planning is concerned, there's not a whole big difference between 4.0 or 2009 or 2012, even 3.0. Master planning, the basics have been the same basically for a long time. Now, in the newer versions, in R2 and R3, there's some additional features, some new parameters, some new checkboxes and stuff that are available. But again, kind of the overall functionality still is basically the same. Supply, demand, net requirements, that whole thing. And then again, as far as people who use master planning and who trust the master planning results, usually in the groups I have about 10% of the people that say they're actually using master planning. And then out of those 10% of people, I usually have 1% or 5% of those people that use, that trust the results and then can understand kind of how to troubleshoot master planning if it throws results that you're not expecting or don't look right. So again, this slide is usually just to get people kind of on the same page that, everyone has questions about master planning. It's not a cut and dry answer. A lot of times it involves a lot of troubleshooting and investigation, and this presentation here hopefully is going to try to give you some more tools to put in your tool set. So if you run into issues or if you run into situations that you can't explain, you at least know where to investigate and some parameters or settings that could be causing the issues that you're seeing. So this is kind of a generic slide about what is master planning. This is one that I've borrowed from a couple other presentations that I've done before. From the Apex Dictionary. If you look at some of the keywords here, we talk about demand management, forecasting of sales, planning of distribution, sales and operations planning, production planning, backlog planning, resource planning, master scheduling. Again, there's a lot of buzzwords in here, but these keywords are really kind of a good example that master planning is really all over the place in AX. It uses inputs from accounts receivable, accounts payable, procurement and sourcing, organization administration, the master planning module, product information management, inventory and warehouse management. A lot of different modules and areas in AX are used by master planning. So again, that comes down to, you know, it's important to understand sort of the different places that these things in master planning are set up. So when you run into issues, you can kind of triage them and understand where to start looking. Because again, you might not know the answer off the top of your head, but if you can look into it and figure out kind of, you know, which parameters are driving the behavior you're seeing, that's half the battle. All right, so some of the basics. You know, that introduction slide where I ask who's on master planning, who's using master planning, and who's not. A lot of times I see that you know, half the audience or less is using master planning typically, and the other half or more are usually interested in sort of what master planning does and how to get introduced into it. So I like to start with a very brief, you know, primer on what master planning is and what it uses in AX in order to get you the results that you're looking for. So first of all, master planning is an engine in AX that looks at your supply and your demand, does some calculations, and outputs net requirements or planned orders. You can see in this slide the types of supply we're talking about are things coming into your system, into your inventory. So purchase order receipts, production order report is finished, return sales orders, you know, on-hand inventory counts as supply, and expected transfer order receipts, same kind of thing. As far as demand that's going out of your system, we're talking about things like sales orders or sales forecast. Safety stock itself, or minimum inventory level, is classified as demand too. And then, you know, transfer order shipments, production lines, inventory movements, transfer journals, those types of things are all demand, anything going out of the system. And then master planning takes both of those pieces of information, your supply and your demand, and a bunch of other generic settings or parameters, and then calculates what are called net requirements. And the net requirements are AX's way of telling you, I think you have enough, or I think you don't have enough to satisfy the demand that's coming into your system. And if you don't have enough, master planning generates what are called planned orders. And that might be planned purchase orders or planned transfers or planned production orders as well. And again, it's important to understand that these are planned orders and not actual orders. These are just suggestions by master planning, and there's an interim step called firming where you nominate a planned order to be an actual order. So at this point, when master planning runs and it spits out these planned orders, they're still just suggestions. The purchasing department doesn't see them on their list of purchase orders to go and send to a vendor, and the production team doesn't see it on their list of production orders of things they actually have to execute until someone firms them into those actual orders. So just briefly about net requirements. Like I said, they're the results of master planning and scheduling requirements. The form itself, the net requirements form, which we're going to show here in a second, shows the amount of supply, demand, and planned supply that you're going to see. And it's a very easy way to kind of identify what's going on, what your inventory is going to look like right now, and what it's going to look like in the future. And then again, the form also shows the relationship between that demand and the supply that's satisfying that demand. So this is referred to as pegging in AX. And it's a link between your planned purchase order and the sales orders, for example, that required you to generate that planned purchase order. So as you can see, this form over here on the right is our net requirements form. And a couple of important things to see about it. The top left where you have a plan selected, right now the dynamic plan is selected. So the net requirements form shows the results based on the plan that you have specified. Also, in the top overview section there, you'll see Warehouse 13 Site 1 and Warehouse 24 Site 2. The middle section where it shows the reference, the orders, the sales orders, and your on-hand levels and stuff, that section and the pegging section below are context specific based on what you have selected up on top. So for example, since we have the 13 warehouse and Site 1 selected, all the results in the middle and bottom section are showing us the net requirements results for that warehouse. So if you wanted to see the on-hand level and sales orders and expected receipts in the 24 warehouse at Site 2, you have to click on that line and it would change the information below. Now down in the bottom section, in the middle section first, you'll see, like I said, your on-hand levels. And then based on requirement dates, you can see the accumulated inventory levels at those certain time frames. So this is kind of an old demo set, but if you look at the on-hand, you can see that in the future at 12/14/2012, We're going to need 5 pieces on a sales order. We're going to need 5 additional pieces that same day, and then we're going to need 21 pieces on 12/21. If you look at our on-hand levels, we have 11 pieces on hand, and then the accumulated kind of keeps a running total of what our inventory is going to be at those given points. And then, of course, in the bottom we have, since I have sales order 00704 selected, it shows the planned production order that is generated for that sales order. So again, let me just go back to this quick. This form is a very important form as far as understanding what master planning is doing for you. You can look at the planned, you can look at your planned orders form. You can go to master planning and look at planned orders. You can look at your planned purchase orders from the procurement and sourcing module. And you're going to see a big list of orders, all items, just for all date ranges, and they're not really ordered in any great way. So the place to start investigating really on if you see a result that you're not expecting is to look at that item and open up the net requirements on it and see if you can trace down sort of what's going on and why that particular planned production order or planned purchase order was generated.
And Jake,
Yeah.
This is John. That screenshot you're showing is AX 2012, correct?
Yes.
But there's some questions about other versions. The stuff you're showing right now and the way to kind of dive into net requirements hasn't changed since 4.0 or AX 2009, or even it's going to be the same in AX 7, correct?
Right, that's correct. Yeah,
Okay.
and again, I'll try to specifically call out where there's differences. As far as this form is concerned, it looks exactly the same through the different versions. Now, you may have, you'll see that this updates, the way the buttons are organized are a little bit different, I guess, but basically everything is the same. So as I was talking about up in the top left, you select the plan that you want to see the results of. Now, another concept in master planning is, the question if you should have a single plan or multiple plans. Now, a plan is basically a set of parameters and options for master planning, and then a plan is executed. So when the plan is executed, plan production orders are created for that plan. Now, if you have a single plan, great. You schedule one job, it runs master planning on that plan, and it spits out a bunch of planned orders for that plan. But if you have multiple plans, those sets of planned orders may be different, even based on the same inputs. So, for example, we talk here in a second about one plans versus two plans. A lot of times you'll hear static plan and dynamic plan. Now, one of the theories is to have two separate plans created. The first plan is your static plan. Now, the static plan is created and it's updated at night or some sort of consistent time period that people are not in the system, and you're just refreshing it basically to recalculate your results, and then you act on that plan throughout the day. So, like I said, you might run and refresh your static plan at night, and then when you come in the morning, the purchasing team and the production team have a plan to act off of. Now, that's great. But throughout the day, let's say you're getting calls from, customers, and they're asking for new material, and they're asking for how much do you have on hand? How long is it going to take me to get this? That kind of thing. So what happens is the sales team can go into the system, they can create a quote, or maybe they want to create a sales order and then kind of give the customer an estimate based on the number of pieces that they're ordering or something. So they run an explosion, or they do some sort of net requirements update during the day. Now, if you're using a single plan, and if they're changing the static plan, that can get the purchasing team and the planning team kind of out of whack, because they thought it was one thing, and then they log in after break or after lunch or something, and the sales team has done some changes, and then all of a sudden their numbers are a little different, right? So the way to get away from that is to have multiple plans, and you have what's called a dynamic plan created, which is a copy of the static plan at nighttime, but the dynamic plan is the one that's changed throughout the day. So what happens is, static plan is a static plan, and it updates at night. After it's done updating, it automatically copies the dynamic plan, so now you have two plans that are in sync. Throughout the day, the purchasing and production teams are working off of the static plan. They're firming orders from there. They're making their changes as they need to in the static plan. And then the sales team is working off of the dynamic plan. So again, they're taking the information that was relevant as of last night, and they're making their changes as needed, and they're running explosions, and they're updating net requirements and stuff, but they're not impacting the purchasing team and the people that are actually making actual orders from that. So that's the idea between having one plan, a single static plan and dynamic plan, and having two separate plans to represent each of those cases. So again, if we have one plan, that means you have the same plan between the static and dynamic. And ad hoc updating of net requirements throughout the day then would affect the main plan and could affect what the purchasing and production teams are seeing. And then also that would mean that the static plan is changing throughout the day as users are updating net requirements, where if you have two separate plans to separate those things out, the static plan stays the same, and then the dynamic plan changes throughout the day and is refreshed and copied basically from the static plan at nighttime again. So the other idea by this is the description of having a single static plan and a single dynamic plan. The other thing you can do is you can actually have multiple plans for other purposes too. So in addition to just separating out, who's working in what and making sure that the purchasing and planning teams aren't being affected by whatever the sales team is doing, you can have multiple plans set up for different circumstances too. So you may have a plan that's set up to use sales quotations, for example, and maybe that plan is something that can generate, planned purchase orders based on, your high percentage sales quotations, and that might give you some additional insight into if the year shapes up like we think it's going to be, we want to include the sales quotes and we want to purchase enough to be able to satisfy those two. Maybe one plan includes forecast and one plan doesn't include forecast. Maybe you want to buy your material based on the sales orders that you have, but you want to kind of know what the forecast might also cause that to look like. So you'd have two separate plans set up. Now again, those plans are going to be completely independent of each other. And you would run each of them independently and review each of them independently and do whatever you need to do with them. And when you look at the net requirements form, you just have to specify which plan's results you want to look at. Like I said, the plans are a set of parameters and other settings that affect how master planning behaves. So on the plan, you can set up a number of different things. So first of all, you can include what types of inventory transactions are looked at when master planning calculates. So like I said, you can include sales quotes or no sales quotes. You can include forecast or not. You can specify if you want your shelf life to apply. So if you're using expiration dates on batches, you can specify here if you want when that batch expires to be taken out of your net requirements. You can also specify time fence override. So on the plan, you can specify a time fence and check a little box next to that time fence that says that you want this fence to override all of the coverage group time fences that are set for that plan. So again, you might have a plan set up here that's a long-term forecast plan or something that looks out 5 years. So you'll set a 5-year coverage time fence and a 5-year forecast time fence with an override checkbox enabled. And then that'll say, I don't care what your coverage group says as far as time fences are concerned. I want to look out 5 years. So for this plan, let's calculate 5 years worth of transactions. So it's important to understand that those are only going to do anything if you have that override time fence set up. And then that overrides the time fences that are set up on the coverage group. So futures and action message parameters on the plan as well are used to indicate if the dates that are calculated here, so your action dates and futures dates, are automatically going to override the requirement date. So again, this is just something to be aware of. I think a lot of times it causes more confusion than it's worth. But what happens here is a futures message is calculated, says that a particular order is going to be delayed. And then the fact that that future message is calculated, that date is then transferred to the planned transfer, production, or purchase order, whatever it may be, that's going to get that inventory in. So you basically are being told that you don't need it there until the futures date. Now there's additional messages calculated on that transaction, but it's still kind of confusing when you look at your net requirements form. So again, if you're seeing planned orders that don't seem to be matching up with the requirement dates that you'd expect, go ahead and check in the plan and see if these parameters are set on the futures message fast tab and the action message fast tab. And then finally, there's a safety margin. So the safety margin allows you to add, a day or 2 days or something around particular transactions to give yourself a buffer and provide for paperwork or inventory moving from one warehouse to another or whatever it might be, so that you're not late. So for example, what happens is, let's say the requirement date of something has to go out, your requested ship date is Friday. If you have a 1-day issue margin specified, master planning sees that basically as you need to be done with your stuff by Thursday. So it provides that extra 1-day cushion in there to make sure that you have your day available, to help with that, whatever transactions might have to take place. Now, it's important to understand that you need to be careful with these because, first of all, the master plan safety margins add on top of the coverage group safety margin. So if you have a coverage group safety margin set up of 1 day and a plan safety margin of one day setup, you're going to have a 2-day safety margin on that particular item and transaction. So that's important to understand. The other thing that's important to understand is this is for each issue transaction, right? So if there's multiple levels in a production order, those days can kind of stack up on top of each other, right? If there's an issue and then there's another production order being created, so that's got an issue, and there's another production order being created all for the same item. Each of those could add on top of each other, and you could end up with 3 or 4 days of additional cushion built into your production planning, which you probably don't need. So again, you have to be careful when you're using safety margins and really think of where you want them and which coverage groups need to have them as well. So as far as overall master planning parameters, these are kind of AX across the company, basically. These are company-specific parameters here, not necessarily based on plan. This is how master planning is going to work for all plans. What we have the ability to do here is specify a couple of things too. So first of all, this is where we indicate which of the plans that we have created are going to be our static and dynamic plans. You can see in the screenshot behind here, this watermark that you can specify different plans for the dynamic and master, or you could specify the same one. So you could have your 1 plan or 2 plan scenario like we showed before. You can also indicate here what the generic coverage group is. So in the case that an item doesn't belong to a coverage group, this general coverage group is going to be used. You can specify dynamic negative days on the master planning parameters. We're going to talk about that in a minute, but it's important to understand that they're set here. The planned orders tab, you can specify if you should use trade agreements or not. And as far as trade agreements go, this is kind of an interesting spot here, I think. You can specify that master planning, so let's step back. When master planning generates planned purchase orders, the planned purchase order is a suggestion saying, hey, purchasing team, you need to create a purchase order to this vendor for this item that needs to be ordered this time, and it's going to cost this much. Where it gets all the information is based off of your product setups, right? So if you look at your product, if you look at the Purchase Fast tab on the release product, there's a field called Vendor. That vendor field is the default vendor for that item. So when master planning sees a need to buy that material, it goes to that vendor and says, hey, create a purchase order to this guy. And we'll look to see, what the lead time is and the purchase price is for that vendor. Now, that's great, but you can also leave that vendor blank and have master planning try to figure out which vendor it should get that purchase order. Now, the way that works is if you have the Find Trade Agreements checkbox enabled and the default vendor on the item is blank, master planning will try to find the vendor based on the trade agreements. There's 2 criteria that you can use. One's the lowest unit price, and the other one is shortest lead time. And by specifying one of those, master planning looks at the trade agreements and says, okay, which out of these trade agreements that are active for this vendor, for this item, which vendor gives me the lowest lead time? And if you have that parameter set, it will take that vendor and put it in the planned purchase order for you.
Hey, Jake.
Likewise, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Another question about kind of how MRP prioritizes things from the audience here is, how does MRP handle reservations when there are 2 competing orders for an item, say on hand equals 1, and it's already been reserved to the order further out? If lead time allows, will MRP reserve the item to the order that is imminent? So kind of like a question on timing if something's reserved and a new order comes in.
Let's talk about that one when we get to the safety stock stuff.
Gotcha.
Why don't you remind me to bring that one up?
Yep.
So the trade agreements, the other option is if you have the lowest unit price. So if you have that specified master plan, you'll look at the trade agreements and say, hey, this is the vendor that will give you the lowest unit price. Use him instead in the planned order. Now the problem is that this is a company-wide setting, so it's not an item-by-item or vendor-by-vendor basis. So I don't know how useful it is, but if you're interested in using trade agreements to find the vendor that should get a particular purchase order, you have to have these checkboxes checked on the master planning parameters, and you can't have a default vendor specified for that item. And finally, on the standard update tab, this is where you specify the defaults that happen when you firm. So when you firm the order up, if you were to select multiple planned orders at once, you can actually group them into a single actual purchase order by some of the criteria that pop up in the dialog box. Now, instead of having to go through and do that each time, you can set the defaults in the standard update tab of the master planning parameters form and indicate, I want to always group my planned orders by vendor when I firm, or I want to always group my planned orders by delivery date when I firm, and group them into, big purchase orders instead of having individual purchase orders for each planned order requirement. So this is kind of, we're getting towards the end of generic AX stuff, and we're getting into a little more specific pieces of master planning functionality that people a lot of times have questions about. Now, one of those things is time fences. And the way that this screenshot or chart or diagram or whatever is laid out is from, you can see here I've got an arrow indicating time. So each of these time fences, the ones on the bottom here are the longest, typically, and as we move up the time fences, we get into the shorter and shorter time fences that I typically see. So for example here, the coverage time fence is typically the longest time fence that you have specified, and the firming time fence would be the shortest. Now what is the time fence first? A time fence is a way to indicate how many days master planning should look out from today's date to find transactions or to do certain tasks. So for example, a coverage time fence is the number of days that master planning looks out to find all of the demand and supply in order to perform its calculations. Right? So it looks out, if you have a 100-day coverage time fence set up, when you run master planning, it looks 100 days in the future and looks at all of the receipts and all of the demand that's going out within that time frame. Anything past that doesn't show in your net requirements form. So if you have sales forecast lines in the system for 10 years from today, if you have a 100-day coverage time fence, it's only going to see 100 days worth of that forecast. So again, the coverage time fence is the longest on here because it's the limiting one. Anything past that, none of these other time fences are going to apply anyways. So coverage time fence is the longest one you have set up typically. If you move up the list, the explosion time fence is also typically as long as the coverage time fence. What the explosion time fence does is it's the number of days out that if it finds a planned production order in that time, master planning will explode the planned production order into its derived requirements. So for example, again, let's say we have a 100-day coverage time fence and a 50-day explosion time fence. So it's shorter than our coverage time fence. For the first 50 days of planned production orders from today's date that we're going to see, master planning will also go down additional levels and say, okay, this planned production order for item X means that you need 10 of item Y and 20 of item Z, and then, so on and so forth. It's going to go down each of those levels and calculate those derived requirements. Past the 50 days, so if we're past our explosion time fence but within our coverage time fence still, master planning does not do that. And what you'll see is a planned production order, but there will be no derived requirements. So it'll say you need to build item X, but it's not going to say in order to build X, you also need Y, and you also need this many of Z. It doesn't do that calculation until you come into the explosion time fence window. So that's typically why I see the explosion time fence out is the same as coverage time fence, because a lot of times you don't want to get into that situation where it's not seeing those derived requirements. Now, if you had raw materials or components that were really, really, really short lead times and it didn't really matter if you saw them, for a couple of weeks out or something like that, then you could have an explosion time fence that's shorter than your coverage time fence. And what that would do is it would reduce the amount of transactions you'd see in your planned orders form because it's not going to generate those planned purchases or planned productions or planned transfers or whatever for those subcomponents until you get within that explosion time fence. As we move up the list, A capacity time fence is used to indicate when capacity should be scheduled across work centers, resources, or resource groups. Now, there's a difference, I guess, between 2009 and 2012. In 2012, they're called resources and resource groups, and in 2009 and earlier versions, they're called work centers or work center groups. But the same principle applies. It's where you do the work. And the capacity time fence specifies, again, how many days out from today's date that planned production orders in that time fence are going to be scheduled across the resources or resource groups. Anything past that, AX will use the inventory lead time to generate the order date for that planned production order. So why that's important is if you have a capacity time fence that's shorter than your explosion time fence and coverage time fence, once you get past that, AX won't try to schedule capacity to figure out how soon you have to build something in order to make it there in time. It'll instead use your inventory lead time. So if you don't have an inventory lead time set up, AX will say it will take 0 days. So once you're past that capacity time fence, AX will say it takes 0 days for you to build, it takes 0 days for you to build 10,000 pieces of this, when in fact it doesn't. But you won't know that until you get within the capacity time fence and AX tries to schedule that on your resources. Again, it's important to understand sort of what kind of implications it has going past those time fences, and then meeting those risks when you set them up. Now, why not have them all set up to be the coverage time fence? That's a good question. I think in more recent versions, 2012, 2009 even, since you can do batch processing of MRP and since you can do multi-threading, it's a lot faster now. And the performance, there's not really, I don't hear a lot of people that have performance issues with master planning where it takes 8, 12, 16 hours to run anymore like they used to have in older versions. So, there's a lot of times not a real need to change the explosion time fence and capacity time fence anything shorter than the coverage time fence. Now, the one benefit that you do have is, like I mentioned before, it does reduce the amount of transactions that you see in your planned production orders forms. Or your planned orders forms, rather. So you got to kind of, determine on if there's too much clutter out there, maybe you adjust the explosion time fence, but you don't want to get it too short because then you might miss stuff. So you just have to kind of be careful when you get into tweaking these time fences. Actions and futures time fences are really just calculations on, or the number of days that requirements within that time fence are going to have actions and futures messages calculated on them. I've recently run into some situations with this, though, where even though the actions and futures don't show up in the form, they're still calculated. So the actions in the front assume that you're making the actions that are past your action time fence. So I've actually started setting these up to the same as my coverage time fence, just so I don't miss those downstream or later actions and futures. That's something to be aware of as well. Freeze time fence is the number of days that you're not allowed to create new planned orders. Master planning is not allowed to create new planned orders. So for example, if we have a 3-day freeze time fence and master planning sees a new requirement for something that has to be built tomorrow, it will not create you a planned production order for that at that date. It'll push it out to the end of your freeze time fence. The idea here is that, within the next couple of days, you shouldn't really be changing your plan anyways because you're supposed to be already executing that. And you don't want master planning jumping in and pushing orders around and moving things out and stuff because you now have a new requirement. It's got to kind of wait its turn and show up at the end of the freeze time fence. So that's where you can set that. Now, firming time fence is used to automatically firm requirements to show up within that time fence. So I've seen a couple people use this, but most people have this set to 0. But again, it's just something to be aware of. So again, we just talked about time fences, a couple extra points. They're based on requested ship dates. So that's important to understand. Capacity and explosion time fences do have the most significant impact on performance if that's really affecting you. You can certainly see the impact there in the session log as well. You can see some of the stuff that's happening. The action messages or future messages or explosion steps are taking longer. You can kind of see some of that stuff. Again, like I said, past capacity time fence, inventory lead times are used. And then there's a recommendation actually from the manufacturing team on their blog that says the recommendation for a coverage time fence on purchased items should be no longer than twice the longest lead time. So again, the idea here is to just reduce the amount of transactions seen in your planned orders form and give the planning team an actual realistic list of things that they can work on throughout the day. But you have to give yourself enough time to see those requirements and have enough time to order them before you're late, right? So the idea here is you want to give yourself the ability to look out kind of 2 cycles worth of lead time to see all those requirements, but you don't really get anything from being able to look out further than that. So coverage groups. Coverage groups are ways to group items together and plan similar items in similar ways. Coverage groups have a lot of settings on them, so time fences and specific planned order behavior on sizes and when those planned orders should be generated are controlled by the coverage groups. They have negative and positive days as well, which we're going to talk about in a minute. So one of the main settings on a coverage group is a coverage code. There's 4 options. The first one is requirement. A requirement option gives us an individual planned supply for each piece of demand it sees. So in this situation where we have a sales order for 1 piece on the first, we're going to get a planned purchase order for 1 piece on the first. Same thing for the second and third. So we have 3 pieces of demand within 3 days. We're going to get 3 individual purchase orders. Now, the requirements coverage code does use order multiples too. So if you had an order multiple of 5 set up, you would get 1 5-piece order here created each time, right? And it'd be ordered basically in 5-piece increments. So you can use kind of the requirement coverage code and the order multiples to get a little bit better situation. But really the idea behind a requirement is for an item that you don't want to buy too much of. So it's either low turn or it's high value and you don't want to keep a lot of it in stock, that you buy only what you need. The next one is period. So a period coverage code uses another field called the coverage period. So when you specify that you want to use the period coverage code, a new field is available for you called coverage period. And in that field, you indicate how many days you want to look out from the first piece of demand and group that many days worth of orders together. So for example here, our first piece of demand is the first. We have a coverage period of 6 days set up. It looks out 6 days, finds all of the demand within that time frame, and generates a single planned supply for that demand with the requested delivery on the first day of the demand. So this allows us to group up all 5 of these, if you used requirement, which would be individual orders, into a single order. But it does bring all that inventory on hand the first day, right? So we have too much inventory all the way until the 7th, basically. So this is kind of, you got to kind of weigh the good with the bad here. It allows us to group all these together, gives us 1 single order, but then we have 7 days worth of inventory instead of 1, right? Now, the other thing that's important to understand here is this is based on the first requirement date of the demand. It's not based on a calendar. So if you create a 7-day period, that's not a weekly coverage group. That's not going to generate you a new purchase order every week. That's going to, when it finds demand, create a week's worth of supply at that point. So you might get one on the first, like here, but let's say we don't get another piece of demand for this item until March 16th. It's going to say at March 16th, how much demand is in the next 6 days and generate 1 order there, right? It's not going to give us individual orders every week up until then. Min-max. So this is another interesting one. The min-max actually controls the size of the planned supply, just like all the other coverage codes do. That's more of what this code does than the min. So the min is used kind of in all of these, right? You don't have to have the min-max coverage code set up to use a requirement or period coverage code. You can use a minimum inventory level across all of these. If you have a minimum of inventory level of 3 pieces here, AX is always going to try to make sure that you have 3 pieces when you do your period coverage code. The difference between a min-max and just using a min is the max. The max is going to be the size of the, AX will try to order in such a size that it brings you back up to your max inventory level. So for example, and these slides will be available for download as well, but you can see kind of Here we have 500 pieces on hand. We have another receipt coming in that brings us up to 750 pieces. And then we have some demand of 1,000 pieces. That brings our accumulated values down to minus 250. And since we have a minimum here of 250 and a max of 1,000, what AX does is, okay, I'm below my minimum of 250. I need to get back to 1,000. So how big does my order have to be? So since I'm minus 250 here, to get to 1,000, the order has to be 1,250 pieces. So this can be used in situations where you have like a maximum storage, availability on your site, or you have regulatory limits on how much of certain inventory you can have available, something like that, that you have to control how big the order is when you get it into the system. And then finally, the last coverage code is manual. And 4 items in a manual coverage group, net requirements are not calculated for these items. I see a question here. Someone's asking if I can share the blog. I do at the end of the slides have a couple of links, and that blog post is on there. So again, these slides will be available, and that link is included at the end of the slides. So I just skipped over briefly before, but positive and negative days are another fields that are included on the coverage groups. And these ones are sometimes tricky, and the nomenclature I think is strange. And people have different preferences on how they set them up as well. So I just like to go through what they do and some suggestions on how to use them. So positive and negative days are the way that you can specify basically the jitteriness, I think is the word that people like to use, of master planning. So what happens here, and let's start with negative days because it's easiest to explain. Let's say we have a situation where we have an existing purchase order coming in on the 17th, and we have a sales order on the 1st. Typically, if negative days are set to 0 and we don't have anything turned on like that, what would happen is AX would say, okay, you have demand here and you can't be late on this, so you need to create a new planned order for this item to be delivered when you need it, right? So it's going to say here, create a new planned order with delivery on the 1st, so you can satisfy the sales order with the requirement on the 1st. Now that's great, but we have an existing purchase order out here, right? So do we really want that to happen? Can that even happen? I mean, if we have lead times on these items, this probably isn't even, physically feasible. So what AX has provided is negative days. Negative days is kind of a window from our sales order or demand of days that receipts in that time will satisfy this demand. So for example, again, if we have negative days set up to anything, like 15 even here, AX will look out 15 days and look for inventory, look for receipts in that time. And if it doesn't find any, it'll generate you a new planned order. Now, if we had negative days set up at 20 here, AX would look out, and then it would find this purchase order here and would peg this purchase order against this sales order and would not require this new planned order. So the way that works, again, that's kind of reducing, by 50% in this case, the number of planned orders or number of orders that we're going to have in the system and have to process. Now, what's going to happen, though, is this guy is still going to have an action message calculator not saying, hey, by the way, the requirement date is the 1st, so you're going to be late. And this guy's going to get futures message calculated saying, you're going to be 17 days late because this is now pegged against your sales order. But from that point, you can maybe contact your vendor or do something here and hopefully try to speed this up. Positive days is the other direction. So positive days is how far back does master planning look to find inventory that will satisfy the demand. So it's the other direction here from negative days. So again, in this case, if we have positive days at 15 set up and we have sales order demand on the 31st, AX will say, okay, from the 31st, I'm going to look back 15 days for receipts, not find anything, and generate a new planned order here for 8 pieces to be created on the 31st. Now again, it's important to understand that positive days, on-hand inventory is a receipt. It may not seem like it, but as far as master planning is concerned, on-hand inventory is a receipt. So if you have positive days, like in this case, that are less than your coverage time fence, AX won't see your on-hand inventory here and will say that you need a new planned order for this item. So what I typically see is people have their positive days set to something like 9999. just to make sure that this never happens, so that their on-hand inventory is always seen. As far as negative days, there's another kind of twist here. So this makes a lot of sense, right? And this works great for lead time items, right? Because you don't want to have AX generate a new planned order for you if there's another purchase order coming within the lead time. So if we have a lead time of 15 days here for this item, and we have a purchase order sometime like on the 10th, we don't want AX to say, hey, create a new planned order here, because it's not going to work anyways. The best we could get it here would be the end of the lead time, and we might as well take this one and try to see if we can speed it up anyways, right? But that means that we would have to create multiple coverage groups that had a number of different negative day settings set up to represent the different types of items and different lead times that we have across the board. Now, in version 2009 and later, there's a new feature called dynamic negative days, and that's controlled on the master planning parameters. And what dynamic negative days does is it uses a new calculation called dynamic negative days and takes the procurement lead time plus the negative days we have in our coverage time fence and builds up this dynamic negative days value, and then uses that instead of just the negative days to see if inventory or receipts should be pegged against demand. So again, this is available in version 2009 and after. This reduces then the need for coverage groups with different lead times, because what we have is the lead time is flexible based on the item that you're planning. And the negative days then is really just that window of how many days past the lead time can I be late and have master planning not create a new planned order for me. So this is truly then a buffer around our requirement date plus our lead time to get us, to see if we can improve this plan at all. So again, dynamic negative days calculation is the lead time plus the negative days. And that gives us our dynamic negative days that we then compare the receipts against the demand. So approved planned orders are another piece of functionality that people a lot of times don't know about. And what they are is they're kind of an interim step between the original suggestion for master planning, so a fresh unprocessed planned order, and a firmed purchase or production order. So there's a field up in the top of the form that says change status, or in 2012 there's just an approved checkbox that you can check, and that changes the status of the planned order from unprocessed to approved. And what that does is it's used to indicate that the order has been reviewed and should be acted upon by someone. So that's the kind of, again, it's a way to say, I've looked at this, I'm going to firm this at some point, so master planning, don't touch it. I'm going to come back to this and firm it, but I want to find, other orders for this vendor, or I want to get through my entire list of this type of material or whatever it is before I create my purchase orders. So check the approved checkbox says, okay, I'm done with this, but I'm going to firm it. I'm just not going to do it right now. And then what that does is it prevents these orders from being deleted when a delete plan or regenerate is run. So again, we think most people have master planning scheduled to run at night. They have it to use the regeneration principle, which deletes everything from the plan and regenerates everything each night. And if you don't have your approved planned orders being used, when you go home for the afternoon and didn't get to firming up the list of stuff that you'd worked on, master planning deletes all those and recreates them again. So you come in the next morning, they all have different planned order numbers. They might be in different quantities with different dates on them and stuff. It's very frustrating. So to get around that, you can approve the planned order, so then the regeneration runs at night, it leaves those ones alone and doesn't touch them. Now, you might get an action message on them that says, like, oh, by the way, there's new demand, you should increase this order or something like that, but it doesn't actually delete the order, and it stays in that approved status for you. Again, it's an intermediate step between the planned order and the firmed order. There's also, instead of just changing the status to approved, you can change it to processed, and the process step indicates that, hey, I've looked at this, I'm not going to do anything with it right now. Master planning, you can get rid of it and delete it next time you run. But just kind of, again, if you look at your planned orders list page as a work list of things to do, it indicates you've reviewed it already, but you're not going to firm it. All right, fulfill minimum. This is the spot that I also wanted to address that question about, what was it? reservations and two competing orders for an item.
Yeah, we have another question too, Jake, kind of is, does master planning consider warehouse capacity when creating planned orders?
No.
Right.
That was an easy answer.
it covers resource capacity.
Yeah, exactly. So, yep, and it does. As far as scheduling stuff, capacities are used in scheduling. So, if you have like a capacity of a tank or something, and you have a process that uses that tank up, that capacity can be constrained through the scheduling. But as far as creation of the orders to bring material in, that's not controlled.
So, or you could set a max up on that item or something if you know.
That's what people typically do. Yep, they'll set a max up on the item and say, we only want this amount to come in because that's all we can handle in our warehouse or something.
Right.
Yep.
Great.
So fulfill minimum. Fulfill minimum was another one of those fields that's kind of set up by default, and you never really even see it until you're having problems with it. And this guy is controlled in the item coverage form, and you can have them by coverage dimensions. So again, if you're planning by site and warehouse, you would have a site and warehouse specific version of this field. So in addition to putting a minimum on, this is also where you control your minimums. The fulfill minimum field indicates where the safety stock requirement date is. Now, safety stock is a requirement just like anything else. It's just like any other demand. If you look at the net requirements form actually and you do your control G to pop up your filter grid, you'll see that the safety stock line is filtered out of the net requirements form by default. But it's a demand. It's a need that master planning tries to satisfy. So it pegs against your on-hand inventory just like everything else does, right? So if you click on your on-hand inventory on an item in your net requirements form, if you click on the on-hand line for an item that has a minimum, down in the lower pegging section, you will see a safety stock line pegged against that. And that safety stock line will have a requirements date. And unless you've changed this fulfill minimum field, it will be today's date. And so what this field does is it moves that requirement date for that safety stock item, that safety stock requirement line. You have 4 different options here. The first one is today's date, and that's what it is by default. So that makes the safety stock requirement date today's date. And what that does is similar to these reservations that I was talking about, is master planning orders its list of requirements by day, basically, and then by priority. So even though safety stock is the lowest priority on the list and should be pegged after everything else, by the nature of it having today's date as a requirement date, it's kind of first in line, right? So we do an order by date and then by priority. So since it's today's date, master planning is the top of the list, and safety stock is at the top of the list, and safety stock then pegs against their on-hand first. So what this causes is you might see a situation where you have a sales order explosion or a production order or a futures date calculated, any of that kind of stuff, CTP, those types of things that are trying to see if you have enough inventory to do something, that the safety stock is pegged against your on-hand first, and then master planning spits out a new planned order and pegs that against your new demand. So you'll see a situation where you have on-hand inventory to satisfy a production order, but master planning, the safety stock is already pegged against that inventory, so master planning has to create a new planned order to satisfy your production order's need, and then it'll generate a futures message on that. So even though you have enough inventory to satisfy it, you'll still get a futures message on your planned production order. I see that a lot. Again, the way you can control that is you can change this field. So today's date is the default, and unless you do anything, you're going to get today's date set. But you can also specify today's date plus procurement time, which takes the lead time into account, the purchase lead time for the item, and we'll move that out to then. There's also a first issue, which will make the safety stock requirement the same date as the first demand. So that kind of says, hey, the first demand is going to win because, again, it's ordered by priority and safety stock is the lowest priority and they have the same date. But it's also not going to make you order something for safety stock unless you have demand for that item. And then finally, a coverage time fence is the other option where you can specify that safety stock requirement is there, but the requirement date is all the way at the end of your coverage time fence. So again, just understanding that these fields are available is something that you can use to adjust where the safety stock sits and then kind of like how the pegging works for your planned production orders and explosions.
You got about 5 minutes, Jake, and
Yeah,
I've got a couple other questions here. So, one question, just quickly: master planning across multiple companies in the same instance.
okay.
Does it work that way?
Sort of. Um,
Great answer,
so
consultant.
yeah, AX 2012 does have intercompany master planning, so it depends on which version you're on, and it makes some assumptions. So intercompany master planning is tricky, but it does use, because you think of, if you have a complicated scenario where company A is buying from company B, and then company B is also buying from company A, it gets kind of tricky in there on how you set that up, which company runs first. You know, there are some assumptions that you can automatically firm some of those intercompany orders too, so that the demand sticks around the next time it runs. It does get kind of tricky, but it is possible. So there is an intercompany master planning setup available. I don't know if that answered the question or not, but
Yeah.
so the fulfill minimum, I did a blog post on this one too on my blog, and you can see the link down here to get to that if you're interested. The last stuff I wanted to talk about here was forecasting. So there's some new features in forecasting that I thought I'd point out that tie to master planning. The first one, and this is in 2012 R2 and later, I believe, you can reduce your forecast by either orders, which is the typical kind of standard way that forecasts have always been reduced, and the new option is by all transactions. So forecast reduction enables AX to say, okay, you forecasted you're going to make 100 this month. You've already sold 50 this month, so I don't want to double build stuff. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to reduce your 100-piece forecast by the 50 you've made and leave a 50 forecast balance out there. Now that's called a reduction. And in previous versions, it used to just be on an order-by-order basis. So like only sales orders could consume it. So if that item was used in a production order, it would not be consumed. The forecast would not be consumed, and you may double build it. So you'd have to forecast at a SKU level there, and it got very tricky. So now you can actually forecast at an intermediate level, so not a SKU level, maybe down at like a product family level or something on an item that's used by multiple bills of material. And if you use the all transactions reduce forecast by field, the production order consumption will actually reduce that forecast as well. Dynamic reduction principle, that's a new feature in 2012, where the period, the forecast reduction period, is not set up by a calendar like it used to be. It's instead dynamically created by the forecast dates. So you might have one period that's a couple of months because you only have 2 forecast lines in the system and they're a couple of months apart. Or if you have a forecast line every week, you're going to have weekly periods. So it's based on, the period is created based on the first forecast date, and the next forecast date is a period created in between those two, and so on and so forth. They don't have to be consistent. It could be every other day. So again, it's just a new way to create dynamic, or a new way to create reduction keys, reduction key periods. And then finally, the item allocation key is a way that you can forecast at sort of a product family level. This is important with new R3 demand forecasting functionality, where you have to use the product family, they're called, to specify the forecast. So it's something that's interesting and important to use. And then you don't even really have to use it for forecasting if you don't want, but you can still use it for reporting. So you can see in the screenshot down below, I've actually created a item allocation key with 2 disparate item numbers. And then I would group those 2 together into my TV item allocation key, and then I could report on that. I could look at forecasts by that item allocation key. I could look at actual orders by that from the supply schedule form if I wanted to as well. So those are some new features that are available and something that's important to be aware of. So John, do we have any other questions that are open still? Jason, does this thing end at 12, or what happens here? People just start dropping off, or does it actually kill me?
Well, we can keep it running for a while if you're available to continue answering questions.
Okay.
You just let me know.
Great.
Sure.
Then Bill has asked, can you explain the first issue setting again for fulfill minimum?
Yeah, so the fulfill minimum field, again, specifies when the safety stock requirement date is, and first issue says that the requirement date for the safety stock should be the same date as the first other demand for that item. So let's say we have an item that has a minimum value of 10 pieces. We don't have any in our inventory, so we're below our minimum right now. But we don't have any demand for it, right? No one's bought it yet. If we use first issue, we're not even going to see a safety stock requirement in there yet. Even though we have a minimum, we're below our minimum, AX doesn't care. The first time someone orders that, though, let's say it's in 2 weeks. Someone orders it with a delivery date of 2 weeks from now. AX looks at that first issue's requirement date and says, okay, by the way, you also need to get to a minimum of 10 pieces here. So it's going to take your safety stock requirement and put it out to that date as well. So that way your safety stock doesn't necessarily look late. It's not first in the list. And you're not creating two separate transactions for it either, right? Because this at least allows you to create, buy enough for that order, plus get you to your minimum level.
Yeah, you might not want to pay shipping or something to just get your safety stock in, but go ahead and get me back up to my safety level on the next order or something.
And the other nice thing is it doesn't, I mean, if you had today's date specified, that safety stock will show up and the planned order for that will be pegged to today. You know, have a requirements date of today, and it will look late, and you're going to get futures messages on it, and it's just going to be kind of messy. So, was there anything else, John?
No, most other people are just complaining about how boring you sound.
That was me, I think, commenting.
Oh. If you don't use future messages, and if you don't use future messages, and you set the dynamic negative days, where can you see the order if it's going to be late? If you don't use future messages.
If you don't use futures messages and you set the dynamic negative days, well, that's the tricky part. So I mentioned that some people have different preferences for negative days and positive days, and what I've seen across the community is a lot of times you'll see people that say set them both to 99999, and then you'll never be told to like buy more inventory than you need, right? Because AX will always look for an order that's coming in, even if it's 3 years from now. It'll see that and it'll say speed it up and get it here in time. Right. The problem with that is that means if you're using the negative days and you're using them like that, say the positive days, but if you're using the negative days like that especially, that means you have to actually look at action messages and futures messages. They're really important then, because AX will not say that you need to buy something to get it there. It will not tell you that you're going to be 3 years late. You know, if you're not looking at those things, it's just you're not going to know it until you're late. And it's important to, you know, if you're using dynamic negative days, you really need to have the actions and futures messages turned on. Now, what I've seen is actions and futures messages are kind of advanced functionality in AX, I think. And they really only work well if you have everything else set up well too. But even if you can't trust the number of days exactly, and even if you can't trust, you know, that the quantity should be increased or reduced by the correct amount, you can at least use them as kind of indicators that something can be better, right? So the sheer fact that it says that there's a futures date being calculated, even if you can't believe that, you know, your working days aren't set up properly or something, your calendar's wrong or whatever it might be, and it's 3 days instead of 6 days, it at least is an indication that you're going to be late on that sales order and you should look at it, right? So I think if you're going to use dynamic negative days, you should definitely turn on actions and futures messages and again, use them as indicators that something is wrong there and that you need to investigate further.
I got another one here, Jake. What is override on hand in the item coverage screen, and where is it used?
Override on hand. I don't know. I don't know what that is. There's a new field in 2012 R3 that's something like that. I don't know if that's is that the same? I don't know who asked this question, but is that the same field you're asking about?
Chandler asked it. I'm not sure. Override on hand, so maybe we'll follow up with him.
Yeah, I'm going to have to look at that one.
Yep. Okay, I think that's good.
Okay, great. Well, these slides, like I mentioned before, Jason, are they going to be, you have a link to them or something on?
Yeah, so we'll get the recording prepared. We'll send an update out to everyone who registered, and in that email we'll include information on how they can get the slides from you, link to download, and any other information there. Yep.
Awesome.
Great.
Thanks for your time today, everyone.
So, all right, and with that, we will wrap up. I just want to remind everyone to look for the survey that will pop up when you leave today. It just takes a couple seconds to fill out, and it gives us and the speakers some really valuable feedback about what you thought of today's event. So please do look for that as you depart. With that, I'm going to end the session. Have a great day, everyone.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Jason.
Yeah, thank you, Jake. Bye-bye.
Yeah.